On in, weary traveler. Hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather around the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. Victor Viggiani from Zealand Communications, Stu Bundy from MUFON Canada, and Chris Stiles, independent UFO researcher, best known for his work on Shag Harbour UFO Incident, all standing by, all here for the full 2 hours. And of course, yes, we'll talk Shag Harbour. What a year 1967 was for UFO sightings in Canada. We'll talk about that as well. Have you got your Falcon Lake commemorative coin yet? Well, if not, maybe too late. They're sold out. We'll talk about that as well. Why on earth would the Royal Mint be doing that? I wonder. Could be part of this whole disclosure movement, perhaps. We'll discuss. Let me also remind you that the three aforementioned gentlemen will all be part of the Alien Cosmic Expo, as will I, happening June 22, 23, 24. We'll give you more details on that, but it is happening, as I say, in June at the Toronto Airport Marriott Hotel. Go to aliencosmicexpo.com for further details and to purchase tickets, or you can go to the live events page at strangeplanet.ca. Right now, let me introduce the boys in the band. He is back from Lost Wages, Nevada, where he and his band played in a rockabilly festival alongside the great Jerry Lee Lewis. He's on the Flying V Gibson guitar tonight. Ian Robertson, welcome back.
Good to be back.
Just a few words, if you would, on the Rockabilly Festival. We're so proud of you.
Non-stop bopping all night till 7 a.m.
Right. And and did the killer pull a knife on anyone? Or
not that I know of.
No,
but, yeah.
he's getting a little long in the tooth for that, I suppose. Yeah. He's still feisty, though. I'm betting.
Yeah, his right hand is crazy on the keys.
I know, you showed me a little bit of that video.
Yeah,
he can still play. The voice is getting a little frail, but he can still.
Yeah, he lets
his fingers do the talking.
Yeah.
Well, welcome back. We're proud of you, and I know you'll share some more stories with us a little bit later. Here in studio on the Rickenbacker bass guitar and occasionally the theremin, story producer Albert Vinzel, and on the Hammond B3 live stream producer Ryan White. Gentlemen, thank you all. Okay, let's get into it, shall we? Victor is no stranger to the program, of course, the executive director of Zealand Communications and the Zealand News Network. He's a retired educator. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology and Psychology from York University and a Master's in Educational Admin and Curriculum Development from Brock. His research and analysis of anomalous aerial phenomena spans about 40 years. His experience involves UFO sightings, report investigation, counseling work with individuals reporting anomalous experiences, presentations, and journalism in the field of ETI disclosure issues. Victor, welcome once again, my friend.
Absolutely great to be with you and with the band. And I should point out, you've got a guitar player, you've got a bass player, you've got a B3, and I'm a drummer. So you're right. You're all set.
Let's take this on the road.
Of course. I'll count it in.
I'll bring my air guitar. Stu Bundy is the Assistant National Director of MUFON Canada, a former CTV reporter turned ufologist. He's crossed over to the dark side. Stu has researched at ancient sites from Stonehenge to modern enigmas like Area 51 the last several years. And he's here to tell us all about the Alien Cosmic Expo. Oh, we're still waiting on Stu. That's okay. Let's get to Chris Stiles, independent UFO researcher, best known for his work on the Shag Harbour Incident and other classic UFO cases in Atlantic Canada. He's the co-author of Dark Object with Don Ledger and Impact to Contact with Graham Sims. Chris has appeared and contributed to several feature UFO documentaries in the US, Canada, and the UK. He holds a blended view of the UFO phenomena where physical reality merges seamlessly with a powerful psychic component. Chris Stiles, welcome to The Conspiracy Show. How are you?
I'm fine, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Likewise. All right. And do we we're still working on Stu. That's all right. We'll get him. Gentlemen, let's talk a little bit about the Alien Cosmic Expo. Victor, while we're getting Stu on board here. I mean, I know it doesn't have a theme specifically, but obviously UFO disclosure is going to be front and center.
Yeah, it's going to be probably one of the dominant features as to, I think, why Stu and all of the people at the MUFON organization here in Canada have taken this event and attempting to bring the event into the forefront with a clear view of looking at disclosure. And that's the thrust of everything. And I know there are so many different aspects to what disclosure can be sort of perceived as, but with the guests that we have, Linda Moulton Howe and Richard Dolan and Stanton Friedman and Grant Cameron. As a matter of fact, 3 of the ones that I just mentioned on there were on the most recent Ancient Aliens episode.
We will get to that.
We'll get to that later. In any case, what the thrust will be, we'll be looking at why disclosure has been hidden under sort of a big cake lid for so long. And now with the recent
740. Nobody appreciates great singers more than Lily Frost because she's a great singer herself.
You took the part that once was mine.
On Zoomer Radio's Theater of the Mind.
Curiosity, or did the devil make you do it? Whatever the reason, welcome back to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. To talk to Richard, call 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
Welcome back. We have a bit of a UFO disclosure roundtable going here ourselves. Victor Viggiani, Executive Director of Zealand Communications, Stu Bundy, Assistant National Director of MUFON, former CTV reporter, and Chris Stiles, an independent UFO researcher who's best known for his work on Shag Harbour, the co-author of Dark Object about Shag Harbour, and the co-author, along with Graham Sims, of Impact to Contact. Let me start with you first, Chris. Victor and I were talking about this off the air, and my producer Albert mentioned when he came in that the Shag Harbour, not the Shag Harbour, the Falcon Lake commemorative coin has now sold out. And what do you think was behind that? Why did the Royal Mint decide this year of all years to issue a coin about Falcon Lake?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you they're trying to figure that out in Shag Harbour.
Indeed, yeah. Why not Shag Harbour?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's been special things that have commemorated the Shag Harbour event in the past, such as the postal cancellation stamp, that they give at the little post office there.
Right.
Those kind of things. Those things are a mystery to me and of little concern. I'm the guy who likes to get out of the armchair and knock on doors and round up witnesses and harass people for documents, etc. But it does raise a thing. Perhaps there'll be a chance yet it'll be commemorated in that way or some other. I don't know. Of little interest to me.
All right. Victor, you had an interesting story because you actually rang somebody up over there.
That's right. In addition to what Chris was just talking about, just after the coin came out, I got the news from a friend of mine, and I said, geez, where is this coming from? And so I called the Mint. I took some time and I called the Mint up in Ottawa, and it took me 4 or 5 stages to go through, but eventually I got to a public relations individual. His name is Mr. Reeves. I forget his first name. In any case, we spent almost a half hour on the phone, and I said, what's the reasoning behind this whole thing? He said, well, we gather our sort of the top 10 list of cultural events, or events that are of cultural interest, and we thought that this one would be ranking up there in the top 3. And so they have a committee put together to find out, which event might be the most, I guess, of interest to people. And they came up with the Falcon Lake incident, and they made a coin. Actually, it's not a round coin. It's almost like a teardrop. It's not round. It's a strange shaped coin. And from that, they expected to really raise people's interest in the whole UFO issue. No, not at all. It's just a cultural interest. That's all that he said. And I tried 4 or 5 times to pin him down. But what I did find out with a real interest is, where does this originate from? He said, well, the whole initiative begins with funding that comes directly from the Minister of Finance. So what does that mean? That means that the office of the Minister of Finance has in some way authorized a coin about UFOs. Now, I'm not sure what that means in the big picture. It may be some interest, little interest, or big interest. But the fact of the matter is, in addition, if you begin connecting all the other dots that Stu and I have been developing over the last little while with the Canadian Research Council on UFOs, that is a very interesting, what I call a converging line of evidence pointing towards just perhaps, in addition to NORAD, the United States government and Canada have a lot in common about what this whole disclosure issue is. And that's one of the feelings that I have about the reasoning behind this. Government knows what's going on, and it's not just a myth. They know something is going on.
Stu, any thoughts on that? Why now? Why this coin on Falcon Lake?
Well, no, I don't know about the coin, but we're adding on to what Victor was saying. He's absolutely right. This is a paramount concern, and it should be to all Canadians. There are things flying over our heads that we don't know about. The government's not telling us. The Falcon Lake incident, it is definitely one of the top 5, top 10. I agree with Chris. Shag Harbour, that was a no-brainer. Should have been Shag Harbour. That story in itself, and I know he's going to get into it, and I was down in Shag Harbour last October for the 50th anniversary, and it was just absolutely amazing listening to a lot of the actual witnesses. Laurie Wickens, he's coming out of their mouths, the story. It's like it happened yesterday, and it's like this story's like an onion. And when you hear Chris tell it, and he was so riveting, I said, you have to come to Toronto. You've got to come and speak and tell your story for all these folks who haven't heard it here. But it's like an onion. You peel it back, and there was a secret naval base in Shelburne. They were laying sensors on the bottom of the ocean to pick up Russian subs. One of the stories was that Shag Harbour, the crash could have been a Russian satellite. There's all sorts of things. And then to me, the one that gave me shivers, and again, Chris says it's so much better, I'll let him say it, but there was a deathbed confession of one of the Navy divers. And I put a lot of stock in deathbed confessions, because when you're going to meet your maker and you have some doubt, is there heaven, is there hell? Well, I'm not going to lie in my last breath.
Right.
In case there is a hell. I want to go to heaven. So I put a lot of stock in this. And the deathbed confession is crazy. So I'll let him talk about that.
Well, we were going to hold off on that, but let's go for it. Chris?
Okay.
He set the table for you.
I would jump in and say, though, I agree with Stu on the importance of Shag Harbour, but Falcon Lake is certainly a worthy case. And a lot of information came to me when I was in Ottawa in the mid-'90s on that, but we'll save that for another time. Since Stu's brought up the deathbed confession, basically I would lump you don't get a sense of the arrow of time in this thing as I investigated. It was with encouragement of people like Stanton Friedman that I jumped into it when he couldn't answer my questions. And the thing is, in the beginning, October 67, Canada's centennial year, anybody who had been near the village water attachment in Barrington Passage, tidal foam. In fact, one of the men in the ship was not fussy about putting a ship in it because he had concerns for buoyancy, found it very strange, was yellow, smelt of sulfur, and some of it at the lead end was still bubbling to the surface as it made toward open sea.
Did anyone have the presence of mind to collect any of that up?
There was an attempt. One of the fishermen attempted to grab some in a dip net, a fine dip net, but it just tended to, evaporate, like dissipate. You know what I mean? So there wasn't anything. Norm Smith was the gentleman who tried to do this, but the thing is, you got to remember the main concern at the time is they thought they were looking for survivors. They thought that a plane had come down. Again, no one reported a UFO, which is very unique. It was the next few days, as reports were coming out to the press, that the Navy, that the Coast Guard, and other agencies that were involved in the search, including those 2 nearby U.S. bases, were referring to it as a UFO. So that label was hung on it by the authorities.
Interesting. Victor, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw some by you, Chris. In your book, your earlier book, Dark Object, you mentioned NORAD, and you spent quite a bit of time talking about an incoming target appeared on the North Bay radar or something, and I think we're just scrambled out of North Bay, and did the radar actually pick up some sort of craft moving at 7,500 miles an hour, stopping, hovering, and then continuing on at 4,400 miles an hour? Do you have anything more to say about that?
Well, these were details given by somebody who worked at the Shelburne base to us, and had also served a Canadian Forces Station Barrington at Baccaro. And it was part of that NORAD chain. It was what was known as the Pine Tree Line. Everybody's usually more familiar with the term the Dew Line.
Right.
There was actually a Mid-Canada and a Pine Tree Line, and the Baccaro base was this end of that. Staffers at that base were privy to that information at passes. We don't have, I have a large amount of documentation. We don't actually have documents that describe that event where this thing entered the atmosphere. But what we do have is many of the military telexes, the primary form of communication that went between the base, and you can see by their response and their concern. And, one of the most telling things that's great when you look at these documents, you often get more in the margin notes than you do in the body of text.
For sure.
And I can actually identify the writing of most of the people. And I managed to meet a lot of them face-to-face at the air desk, that had served at the time in Ottawa where they ordered the underwater search. And, they told me face-to-face they believed this was the real deal. You know what I mean? And I think one of the things that screams that is one of the telexes that orders the underwater search at the top. Squadron Leader William Bain, who's quoted in the Chronicle Herald article that went out as a line story around the world, writes UFO in big block letters at the top and underlines it 3 times. I looked at thousands of these documents and reports, and that's the only time I've seen that. When I asked him, he said, well, as far as we were concerned, this was it,
Is that what makes it, Shag Harbour is often described as the world's only officially documented UFO incident?
Yes, well, that's it. I mean, the thing is, there was, for example, a memo that circulated through Defense Headquarters 36 hours after the incident began, and there's 4 little paragraphs that describe the incident in a briefing to the Defense Minister and others, and they all sign off on it. And in the 3rd paragraph, it actually says, preliminary investigation has been conducted by the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax, and it has been determined that no flare, float, aircraft, or in fact any known object is responsible for this UFO.
At what point is it seen traveling under the water?
Well, I don't suppose it was seen in the sense of a visual, right? But initially, of course, as you know, the Coast Guard arrived, and eventually 7 naval divers were sent to the last known surface position at, just half a mile out from the impact site. And, they searched there for 5 days. But what we now know is that nearby Shelburne base, which was Canada's most secret base at the time, it was the coordination center for submarine detection for the whole Atlantic Ocean, and it was hooked into 2 major grids. One was called the MAD grid, which stood for Magnetic Anomaly Detection, and the other one was simply a hydrophone system where they microphoned the whole Atlantic Ocean. And they were tracking this thing as it moved under the water, and also they had aircraft going over and dropping sonar buoys.
Chris, I got to jump in here. We're going to take a quick time out. We'll come back. Chris Stiles talking about Shag Harbour, Stu Bundy, the Assistant Director of MUFON Canada, Victor Viggiani from Zealand News Network. Back with more in a moment. Stay with us.
The truth is not out there. It's right here. The Conspiracy Show.
Thinking about your next truck? Think F-150. Built with military-grade aluminum alloy combined with high-strength steel, this tough truck handles the elements and stands up to the test of time. And that adds up to lower costs of ownership, leaving more money in your pocket. Now get yours for 0% APR purchase financing up to 72 months on select new 2018 F-150 models. Plus, eligible Costco members get an additional $1,000 off until May 31st. Visit findyourford.ca or your local Ford store for details.
In celebration of Zoomer Magazine's 10th anniversary, we invited Canadian associations to nominate their most inspiring members. And we got some amazing Zoomers. Like Lillian Cardinal, who took up swimming in her 40s and now at 68 swims competitively at the Canadian and world levels with Master Swimming Canada. Embrace life with energy and you will discover new possibilities, she says. This is
There's no charge. Look after yourself. Promise. Google high definition vision. Learn about Herzig. Call us for a consultation. There's no charge. Look after yourself. Promise me.
When your transmission won't go, go to Mr. Transmission. They get you back on the road fast. See their website at mrtransmission.com. If you're sure your phone isn't tapped, call now. 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
Welcome back. Stu Bundy stays with us. Alien Cosmic Expo coming up June 22, 23, 24 at the Toronto Airport Marriott Hotel. And the more recent one is Impact to Contact. Now, before the break, Chris, you were talking about the Navy dive team that went down, and they were looking. Was it 5 days later, or they were? Anyway, pick up where you left off during the break about these divers that went down looking for this whatever it was that landed on the water just off of the coast of Shag Harbour.
Yeah, there was what happened is on the first night, of course, the Coast Guard arrived from the life-saving station, and they got on scene and searched until 3 a.m. and planned to return at first light. They had a couple of RCMP divers on the scene and were trying to re-interview witnesses and just get things together. They were also checking, of course, with the Rescue Coordination Centers to see if there was any late or missing aircraft. But as the composite details were being pooled together, it was becoming pretty obvious they were dealing with something unusual. Their observations in Shag Harbour were forwarded through the RCMP to Defence Headquarters in Ottawa. From there, it was shuffled down to what was the Air Desk, Canada's equivalent of Blue Book. But then again, the Air Desk was more than that because we actually did on-site investigations. Shag Harbour, Falcon Lake being a couple of them that year. And to put that in perspective, that year they would have received 256 reports from RCMP or police that they thought were worthy, and there were actually 9 on-site investigations, to give you some perspective. Anyway, what happened is once clearance was given to Squadron Leader Bain to spend the money, he sent a request to Maritime Command in those days, which was in Halifax, to order an underwater search, and 7 divers from the Fleet Diving Unit were sent down, and they hired a local tender, and they looked for the next 5 days until last light on Sunday evening. The crash occurred would have been Wednesday night, 11:20, and at that point the effort was canceled, claiming no results officially. However, interestingly enough, there was no attempt to explain it away with some kind of cover story like a weather balloon or mishap or whatever. And ironically, however, though, the story that was unknown to the public, the Shelburne story, Nova Scotia, Canada in 67 wasn't like New Mexico in 47. You just couldn't send everybody home or claim war jitters or something like this. But I think somebody was half clever in Ottawa and looked at this and thought, you know what? They knew the real operation outside the public eye was 25 miles away off the coast of Shelburne. Let's let them look at Shag Harbour. We couldn't put it away. You couldn't hide that anymore, so let them look there. They already knew the thing had left the area under the water, and they were already down trying to gather or contain any debris or any artifact they might have found. So, unfortunately, Shag Harbour was, in a way, its own cover.
We do want to talk about Shelburne, but I just want to invite Stu Bundy to jump in here. I don't want to leave you hanging there, Stu. If you have any questions or comments on this at any time.
Yeah, no, it truly is, Canada's Roswell, and the way Chris has investigated this throughout the years. I don't know of any other UFO investigation that has had this kind of coverage and this kind of in-depth analysis and just basically hard work from any other researcher. You can think of Stan Friedman and Roswell. I mean that parallels what Chris has done for this. But yeah, like you said, there's still a lot of questions, and hopefully Chris will get to the bottom of it someday. But we may never know for sure. But what I do know is that those deathbed confessions are quite telling, and I really think we've got something there.
Victor, I know you had a question about the Shelburne incident.
I think it's important to recognize, or at least try to obtain the distinction between what happened in Shelburne and 25 or 35 miles to the other side of the peninsula, what happened in Shag Harbour. And my understanding, Chris, is that you had a long conversation and wasn't at times pleasant with a fellow named Harry. Was he one of the divers?
Yes, he was.
Okay.
He was one of the 7 Granby divers.
Right.
And, one of the things when we released Dark Object and that came out, that these men, we granted them anonymity, but it was a very limited anonymity. There wasn't that many men in the Fleet Diving Unit in those days in Halifax.
Yeah, but you really had some, I don't know if it came to fisticuffs or anything, but he gave you a pretty hard time in trying to separate the two incidents, and he said to you, you'll never get the Shelby story.
Well...
Isn't that what he said?
Yeah. And the thing is, Shag Harbour, was a headline story. It was out. It was the one the public knew, right? Mm-hmm. But what happened in Shelburne, they tried to keep a lid on, and they did. In fact, it was only a scandal in the 80s that revealed the true nature of the base there where this was happening. Mm-hmm. For a long time, it operated under the cover story. There's even a U.S. website that covers this quite well, an official U.S. Navy one. But the cover story for the Shelburne base was that it was an oceanographic, hydrographic research station. But in fact, it was the coordination center for submarine detection for North America, right? Mm-hmm. And when the base opened in 55, it flew the U.S. flag only. In 62, it was a joint effort, similar to a NORAD arrangement, right? But that base, you can imagine, if you got 2 strange craft sitting on the bottom halfway between the docks of the base and nearby McNutt Island, I mean, they quarantined all the men, they put the clamps down the media. They tried to close Sandy Point Road to local residents and everything. But the world was distracted by Shag Harbour and what was happening elsewhere. I mean, Shag Harbour, Shelburne were just the tip of the iceberg. Down east here, we often refer to it as the night of the UFOs, because if you look at police files, I mean, there's just UFO reports everywhere from that same night. And in fact, just off the coast there was a dragger with 18 men that was surrounded by 4 UFOs, and they called the Mounties, and they came in and they filed a report that same night.
All right, we've got to take
And this was before Shag Harbour hit the media.
All right, we'll come back and we'll explore the rest of the iceberg. Victor Viggiani, Zealand News Network, Chris Stiles, Dark Object, the Shag Harbour UFO incident, Stu Bundy from MUFON Canada. Back with more in a moment. Stay with us.
before you lease or finance your next vehicle. Smart, responsible debt protection.
You want the truth? You can handle the truth. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. To get the truth, call Richard now at 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
Welcome back. Stu Bundy, Assistant Director of MUFON Canada, is here. Victor Viggiani, Zealand Communications, and Chris Stiles, the co-author of Dark Object. We're talking about the Shag Harbour UFO incident. But perhaps we, as Chris explained, that's provided its own cover because the real action perhaps was up in Shelburne near a joint U.S.-Canadian submarine base. But let me just bring Stu Bundy in here because he's just staying with us for one more segment. And Stu, I just wanted to give you an opportunity once again to promote the Alien Cosmic Expo conference happening up in June. So give us all the particulars again.
Sure, absolutely. June 22nd, 23rd, 24th. That's the Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You can get tickets at the website aliencosmicexpo.com. The Friday is the Experiencer Day with Kathleen Marden. Saturday, a full day with speakers. Sunday, a full day with speakers. Chris will be doing his presentation Sunday morning, and then there is a roundtable, disclosure roundtable, moderated by yourself, Richard. And thank you very much for agreeing to help us out again this year. It's the disclosure subject. And I do have something to say to Chris about Shag Harbour in a second, but I just have to get this. And the disclosure subject is bigger than ever since December 16th, 2017, last December, when the Pentagon UFO video, the first one was released. There's three of them now. They're called Gimbal, Fleur, and Go Fast. And that was a game changer. I've been in this for 15 years as a field investigator. We've got 30 field investigators. They're all volunteers across Canada. We have 500 MUFON members, 5,000 worldwide. We're in 27 countries now. But this is huge. It's nothing that's ever happened like this. The Americans are releasing this. What is Canada? What's Canadian government doing? They're doing nothing. And Victor can attest to this. From an inquiry from Victor, the response he got from the Department of Defense was some lame picture of a Billy Meyer UFO with the caption underneath saying something to the effect that, sorry, we don't bother ourselves with trivial things like this that aren't real. I can't. I'm just paraphrasing. Victor can correct me there. But that's ridiculous. Everybody is coming out. The British Department of Defense released tens of thousands of documents. Peru, we've got the Chilean Air Force video. Everyone's coming out. And what are we doing? Nothing.
All right. Well, it's funny you mentioned the government's official response was we don't bother with trivial matters like this. But going back to 1967 in Shag Harbour, that was a banner year for UFOs. Not only in and around October 4th of '67, but there was Falcon Lake. There was a famous sighting in Calgary around that time. There was a famous crop circle, I think, in Camrose. Sightings were up like threefold or fourfold from the previous year. And then Chris Witkowski uncovered these documents at the National Archives, something like 28 pages, showing just exactly how interested the Canadian government was. Someone was preparing a briefing for, I suppose it was Paul Hellier's replacement as Minister of Defense. So obviously in '67, there was a hell of a lot going on, and the Canadian government was clearly very interested.
No, they absolutely were. And when I talked to Paul Hellier a couple of weeks ago, I said, you were there. You're at the highest position as Defense Minister of Defense. And, what did you know? I mean, certainly I asked him about Project Magnet with Wilbur Smith and from 1950 to 53, where they were studying magnetic anomalies because they believed that the saucers would tap into the magnetic field of the Earth, and that's how they use it for propulsion. And they also were surmising that how they controlled the craft, how they actually directed it and moved was through psychic ability. And this was back in in the early 50s. And Paul said he didn't know anything. He didn't hear anything about
the university, and they made a pretty good effort. The only trouble was they'd put a rider in place where if they needed field units, they were to call the RCMP, but for some reason that never, ever happened. And when these two men retired, nobody took up, the cause with them, and it just faded away, and they just started filing reports like they did with Blue Book in the States, which at that point had been canceled. And this continued, and those reports would eventually make their way to the... Well, according to local residents, they place it at the same time. The residents here remember the attempt to close Sandy Point Road that many of them lived on. This is the one single road that went out to the U.S. base there. There was so much happening, but Shag Harbour, by allowing the media in, by having the Navy do an underwater search, it kind of eclipsed the...
Chris talks about... the barge is one thing. Then they speak about an atomic furnace and the attempt to explain away what might be down below there and hoisting it up and trying to use that as a cover story as to what might have happened with 5 or 6 or 6 or 7 ships in the area. There seemed to be total confusion, A, to what was happening, and then B, why did they decide on a story called an atomic furnace being hoisted up by a barge? It's totally confusing to me.
It's an odd one.
So they brought in a barge, and they were going to do another rescue operation? There was something on the floor of the ocean?
Well, again, this is what some of the Granby divers claim. What is clear, because there were pictures of it in the local paper, the Shelburne Coast Guard, of this huge ocean-going barge, and it had huge tarps on it. This thing was just an enormous thing, and the cover story, if that's what it is, claimed that they were taking nuclear furnaces, whatever that's supposed to be. They came in because supposedly the barge was leaking and needed a repair. It was only in at the port for something like 6 hours, and it sailed again. It was supposed to take these up the St. Lawrence to Sodus, New York, but it's a very strange story, make of it as you will, but it's not every day that right in this time frame on the Saturday after the Shag Harbour incident is they haven't even called off the underwater search there, that you had this huge U.S. barge come in towed by an ocean-going U.S. tug, to take nuclear furnaces up the St. Lawrence.
And were there not some sort of attempts to get film down below?
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, in fact, the diver who told me this, interestingly, I mean, like I've said, one of the frustrating things about the Shelburne story, and I've always referred to it as the story, unlike the Shag Harbour incident, we don't have the official documents. But one of the things I was able to do was, like when somebody came to me and they said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so," and they, told me the position. Back in those days, they used to have this great thing in Canada called Might City Directory. It was like the phone book, but you could go through the streets numerically and that. You could go through names, and it even told you what a person's job was, right? And when I looked up the gentleman who claimed to film this, he is listed in the 1967 book as Underwater Naval Photographer, RCN, Active Service. You know, so he wasn't just some swabby in the uniform telling a tall tale. This was his position.
And again, Harry, one of the divers, said to you, "You'll never get this story." Is that right?
Well, that's what he said. I mean, you got to remember that when these guys come in, you know, they're not taking this stuff home. I mean, when I would ask a question, they would give me a very detailed answer, such as, like, they say they found a few little artifacts and pieces in this. What did you do with them? Well, they loaded them on an old Army deuce-and-a-half truck, which they called Old Sid, and they drove it to Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, to the Defense Research Board building on Grove Street, which is still in that location. But like I say, you know, for all the documentation we have, the orders, the analysis of the Shag Harbour incident, that hard documentation is wanting for Shelburne. But at the same time, we have RCMP reports and other documentation that mentions that there was a second search effort and another incident there.
So are we going to call that building in Dartmouth our Hangar 18?
Well, it's the point where we lose track, where the story goes cold. So, yeah, it's a place many people drive by every day between our two bridges.
Well, I said to Richard earlier, Roswell has its balloon story, and Shelburne has its atomic furnace story as a cover-up. So there seems to be some similarities.
That's
there.
a sexier cover story for my book. An atomic furnace. That'll keep people at bay, though, right? You don't want to mess with that. Anyone will, you know, a weather balloon is not going to scare anybody off. But, you know, talking about a leaky nuclear furnace, yeah, that'll keep the folks, the nosy Parkers away. We'll take a time out. We'll say goodbye to Stu Bundy. Stu, I know you've got to run. Thank you so much for this.
Thanks, Richard. It was great being on. And Chris, can't wait to see you as well in a few weeks. And thanks, Victor. You're awesome. Victor is our Canadian disclosure warrior.
All right, Stu, all the best. Thank you. Chris Stiles and Victor, stay with us. Back with more on the other side. The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Welcome back. Our 2-hour round table featuring Victor Viggiani, Executive Director at Zealand News Network, Zealand Communications, and Stu Bundy, Executive or Assistant Director of MUFON Canada. He has now left us, but we still have Chris Stiles with us. Chris, the co-author of Dark Object, and we're talking about the UFO, the Shag Harbour UFO incident. Of course, he's also the co-author of Impact to Contact with Graham Sims. And we're going to open up the phone lines as well if you have questions and comments, not only about Shag Harbour. Maybe there's another UFO incident in Canada you want to talk about. We can perhaps get into Falcon Lake. Before that, let me ask Victor, because we were talking about, the documents in the National Archives. There are something like 9,500 digitized documents that people can go on one of these gov.ca websites.
Right.
It's kind of a pain in the butt to try and source these. But tell me what that's all about. And then I also want to talk about, you have kind of a new initiative as well called the Canadian Research Council on UFOs.
Right.
We want to talk about that as well. But these 9,500 documents, when were they released, and how do we find them and search them and so forth?
Well, they were released a long time ago. I'm not exactly sure the actual year that they were released, but I discovered them, I think it was 96 or 97, and I was just paging through documents, looking for things, and I came across a page called Canada's UFOs, the search for the truth. And well, this is interesting. And it said, click on here for data. And I started clicking, and then it came up with 9,500 files on UFOs. And I did a cursory reading of the first few. And what I found out was it's extremely difficult to ferret through these things, 9,000 files, and they have not made it easy for you. You go onto the site, and you've got to list the date of the sighting you want, the location of the sighting that you want, and a whole bunch of other information, plus what department you want. Do you want the Department of National Defense? Do you want the Department of Transport? Do you want the National Research Council? Or do you want the RCMP? And they're all categorized within those 4 categories. So you really have to know exactly what you're looking for. It's like, you want to find a number in the telephone book or a person in the telephone book, and you just blindly put your finger down on one and you just read from there. It's extremely difficult to ferret through these things. So to begin with, I started a week, maybe 2 weeks process of getting up every single day and going to this crazy site and trying to figure out how to parse through these things, and then coming up with certain kinds of documents that meant absolutely nothing. They were just, UFO reports by Uncle Frank and Aunt Martha sitting in their back porch and saying that they saw a light. They report it to the RCMP or to whoever. You read through that 400 or 500 times, and it gets pretty boring. But then eventually you come up with joint intelligence reports from the Canadian Department of National Defense, intelligence councils or agencies. And you get a paragraph stating we need to keep the UFOs under wrap and follow the U.S. policy of non-disclosure about UFOs. And
wow.
It says, and then it says directly, we need to follow the United States Air Force policy on this matter. So you've got the Canadian government, this is back in, I think it was 1951 or 52 of this particular document. So you've got the Canadian government as far back as then in lockstep in trying to keep this stuff away from the public. And then they talk about what happens if a UFO were to land, who to contact, where you take the thing to if it crashes, all these documents. So when you read this, after 300 or 400 documents, and you come up with one, maybe one that's of even minimal significance, you have to keep on reading more and more and more and more. And I stopped at around 3,000 and something. I just couldn't take it anymore. So it'd be worthwhile to continue on. And I'm talking about letters from ministers of defense, Harkness, Mr. Hellyer. They responded. They actually responded to people who had written to the Department of Defense. They wanted to know about UFOs. And Harkness and Hellyer and other ministers of defense said, we know nothing about these things. So, when you take a look at how intrusive all this stuff could really be, if you want to sit down and go through every single file, you'd be there till next, whenever. So it's extremely difficult, and the government has made it very, very difficult for anyone to make sense of these things, as Chris can find, can corroborate. The government does not make it easy for us to find out what's going on.
And what is this initiative you have, this Canadian Research Council on UFOs?
Well, it's part and parcel of what I just said. What we want to do with this, with the council, is make or create an awareness among the Canadian public that the government has information about this. And these files are so difficult to find. What one of my responsibilities is, at least I feel that it is to make this as easy as possible for regular citizens to go to the site and go to specific documents to read how the Canadian government is involved or has been involved in this. Okay, and will continue to be involved in it. That's the one responsibility that I have with this, with the Research Council. The second thing is to make our elected officials aware of what the heck is going on, because I'm convinced, and I have proof, that they have no idea what's going on. And the proof that I have, it comes from former Minister of Defense Peter MacKay. And when I queried him on a NORAD incident back in 2001, I explained the entire situation to him about the scrambled jets out of Comox Air Force Base, where they went, the altitude they were at, what they encountered, an LR-35 jet, medical evacuation jet out of Anchorage, Alaska, seeing exactly the same thing. He knew nothing about it, couldn't find the file that I had. Okay, so it's quite clear that the people in the government positions aren't read into this thing. Or they're pretty big liars, or they're really good liars. I would suspect out of courtesy they just don't know what's going on. And that information is kind of corroborated by Paul, because back then he didn't really have
Paul Hellyer.
Yeah, Paul Hellyer, right. He didn't know anything about this. He says he was too busy, unifying the armed forces, which I know. I mean, I've talked to Paul enough to realize that that's what he was doing. So what we're trying to do with the council is make these politicians, the current Minister of Defense, Mr. Trudeau, the entire cabinet, aware of what's going on. And that's the reason why if you go to the MUFON site and have a look at the CRCU letters that I've sent to the Minister of Defense and to Mr. Trudeau and to all cabinet members, indicating to them that these files are there, that they must look at them. And that's available on the MUFON website right now. And I've faxed that letter to each individual. I have sent an email to each individual, and I've sent registered copies in the mail that cost me $20 each, by the way. And so we want to find out if these people will respond to my request, my direct request, to find out what's going on. Do they have the courage to come forward? And I have invited them to the Alien Cosmic Expo to come. We'll have chairs ready for them, open, in reserve, if they want to sit down there with us and become open about this. And it's a challenge to the government, and I do not want to be confrontational. I want to help them understand, because I know they don't know what's going on. So it's an educational process that we're involved in here, right. Educating people like the former minister, by the current Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister of Canada.
Chris, I want to talk to you about other Atlantic UFO incidents in Atlantic Canada. Aside from Shag Harbour, which is and Shelburne, which are sort of the biggies, what other Atlantic Canada UFO incidents have you been researching?
Well, why don't I tell you my favorite one?
Yes, please.
And it's become a favorite down east here of some of the other people that dabble in the phenomena, Paul Kimball, etc. There was a case in Lower Sackville, Nova Scotia, here in 1976. And it really an unusual one. What happened is a woman, and back then all the names still appeared, the Privacy Act wasn't like it is today. She called the RCMP detachment in nearby Bedford, Nova Scotia, just outside Metro, and said, could you please send an officer to the house? There's a UFO over my house, and I'm not feeling too good about it. So the RCMP dispatch it. Near midnight, he arrives at the Lower Sackville residence, and when he gets there, in fact, there were 3 UFOs over the house. And the officer describes them as lozenge, sort of oblong-shaped craft in 3 sections. And the middle section is kind of like a tea strainer with a green light moving around in it. He stays with these people for 2 hours on the front lawn drinking coffee, sharing his field glasses with the residents, brings out some neighbors and that, writes this nice little one-page report about this, and expresses an opinion, which they typically don't, at the end that says, look, after he communicated with the Halifax International Airport at the time, the nearby Shearwater Base in Dartmouth, and cars in the distance that were at other hills and had a good vantage point. And he expresses the opinion that what he's seen could not be a distant astronomical object and was not conventional craft, because I would have been able to tell the difference. And he signs the report. Well, when I found this report, I stuck it on my fridge because it was nearby, and one day I was in the area and knocked on the door hoping the woman still lived there, and she did. Mrs. Webster answered the door and invited me in, says, "Oh, I'd love to talk to you." Her husband had passed away since this report. This was the mid-'90s when I located her. And she basically told me exactly what was in the report without any embellishments. It said, "We've been watching for years, but we never seen anything since." Her adult son was still living with her and the daughter. And it was interesting, but it didn't go beyond that. However,
let me just get you to hold on, Chris. Pardon the interruption. We'll pick up on the other side. Chris Stiles is with us. We're talking about UFO incidents in Atlantic Canada, UFO disclosure, you name it. We're on it. Victor Viggiani, Zealand News Network here as well. Back with more in a moment.
A reminder from Zoomer Radio. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio, AM 740.
Welcome back. Chris Stiles is with us, co-author of Dark Object. We're talking about the Shag Harbour UFO incident, other UFO incidents in Atlantic Canada. Victor Viggiani stays with us from Zealand News Network. And Chris, you were telling us about this other incident. This woman who saw these objects over her house. How long were they hovering? About 2 hours, did you say?
2 hours, yeah.
My word. One was described as looking like a lozenge, and the other was like a...
They were all similar. There were three of them, and the officer estimated they were about 500 feet in altitude.
Okay. And you tracked this woman was still around when you tracked her down in the mid-'90s?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. She invited you into the house, and she basically corroborated everything that was stated in the report.
Yeah, interesting sighting. You know, it's nice to see that the UFOs lingered for the officer and everything, you know, so we have an official witness. But here's where it gets interesting. At the end, he mentions the neighbors who were also witnesses to the event, right? After Mrs. Webster completes basically telling me what's in the report, I ask if the neighbors still live next door. And she's like, "Oh, well, yes, but it wouldn't do you any good to speak to them." And I said, "Well, you know, in the interest of completeness, I will." And Oh, she said, they probably won't say anything. She says, you got to understand, we don't get along with the neighbors. So anyway, I went over and knocked there and made the effort, and there was no response at the time. I had their phone number. Everything was complete in this RCMP report. And I kept calling back, and somewhere about 3 weeks later, Richard, I got a response. And the gentleman picked up the phone. I said, is this Mr. Robert Bedford? He says, yes. I said, I'd love to speak to you about your UFO sighting back in 1976. And he said, my what? And I said, your UFO sighting. Well, he said, I don't think I ever had one of them. And I said, well, you're listed as a witness in this RCMP report. And he said, well, who said that? I said, I guess your neighbor is the Websters. And he says, oh, God, the Websters could have seen anything.
Uh-oh.
Well, this wasn't looking very good all of a sudden.
No, I'll say.
But I said, hey, I do have an RCMP there, officer. And he said, when was this again? And I repeat the date, and he says, I don't even think we lived here then. So I can hear him asking his wife over the phone, dear, when did we move down from Ontario? And she said, who is it? What is he? He goes, never mind, when did we move down? She tells him the date, and he goes, well, I guess I was here. But he says, fella, he says, I think you're spinning your tires here. And I can hear the wife saying, dear, what is it? And he said, oh, the Websters or somebody saw a UFO. And she says, I can hear her saying to her husband, dear, that was the night. Remember? The night.
Aha.
And all of a sudden he pauses, and he goes, just a minute, and he covers the phone. And then he comes back on, he says, yeah, I'm sorry about what I said, and I shouldn't have spoke of that about the neighbors. He goes, you got to understand, we don't get along. I was like, yes. And he says, well, I know what you're talking about. So I said, so you were a witness to this? And he says, well, I didn't see anything. And I said, well, can you explain? He said, well, it's kind of embarrassing, but me and my wife were upstairs hiding under the bed.
Oh.
So I'm saying, hiding under the bed. Well, he says, the house was shaking and the noise was deafening.
Oh, my.
Meanwhile, in the report, their neighbors are out on the lawn with the officer. They hear nothing. It was almost like it was calling out, trying to get their attention, right?
Right.
And I said, this one long, he says, listen, I'm a naval architect for D&D. He said, I knew this thing, whatever it was, low over the house, wasn't a Sea King or a Labrador helicopter. He said, and I didn't want to know what it was. So I said, well, how did your name get here? He says, well, that's the funny thing. All of a sudden the noise stopped, and I heard a knock at the door. And I come down, and that was the RCMP officer. And he wanted me to step outside and look, he says, but I wouldn't.
Wow.
So what was that? You know?
Indeed.
And I just love that. But, you know, it's almost, I found several other cases like that down east here. And I think they come under the heading of, you know, those type of cases looked into by Jacques Vallée, you know, what you might call reality transformation. And I believe there's a type where two people can stand there, but the event is experienced and witnessed very differently.
Right.
And it's just amazing. And it puts a tingle up your spine when they tell you this story. And, you know, boy, and nobody went to the media. These cases are what I call very pure, and I just love them.
It was that particular sighting, that was in 76. Is that to be found on that .gov.ca website, do you know?
It might be. I'm not sure. I actually found the case in Stanton Friedman's basement in Fredericton. And he gave me a box of files to go looking through back then, just hoping to find more about Shag Harbour, and that's one of the many down east cases here I found that I spend a lot of time looking into and re-interviewing people. You know, when you think about it, we have a unique situation here in Canada. The RCMP reports, they're a disinterested third party largely, and when they go investigate a UFO case, it's kind of like, doesn't matter if it was a murder or a theft or a stolen car, they just write it up. You know, when their training says, just write what you see, write what you hear. And it's a great place to find and exploit great cold cases like that, and we're very lucky.
I've got a bit of an insight for you, Chris. There's a fellow up here, his name is Dave Scott. He has a podcast called Spaced Out Radio, and I've been on the podcast a couple of times. And recently, about 3 weeks ago, I had a conversation with him. We were talking about the ACE conference and trying to get together to do a little bit of promotion. And he said, Victor, there's something I should tell you. And this happened to him about a month ago, is my understanding. And there was an incident near his house, in his community, where the RCMP had to be called. And so the RCMP showed up. I don't know what the incident was. It wasn't a UFO sighting or anything like that. but could have been a domestic dispute. I don't really know. But the fact of the matter was that people crowded around, and there was just things going on back and forth. So Dave Scott, being the inquiry-based individual that he is, very hard questioner, he spoke very, very closely with an RCMP officer who was on the site administering to the situation. So once things settled down, Dave had a conversation with the RCMP officer. Can I just ask you a question? So the officer, he's just a young fellow, the officer was. And he said, sure, go ahead, shoot. When you guys get a report about a UFO, what do you do? He said, oh, it's simple. It's simple. The first thing we do is we call Cheyenne Mountain. We let them know that there's a UFO sighting, wherever it happens to be, and then the jets are scrambled. And they said, how long has that been going on? He said, well, as long as I've been an officer, for at least 8 or 10 years, and probably even longer than that, way back in history. So it is common practice for the RCMP, and I go back to your situation, Chris, that you described about those UFOs. It might have been interesting to find out at that particular point if there was a call made to Cheyenne Mountain or even NORAD, because this young fellow was he was totally convinced this is RCMP protocol.
Well, it is, and that's, there's a chapter in my book there about the Space Object Contingency Plan. The chapter is called The Master Plan, and one of the things that surfaced in my research on Shag Harbour was the release of this in the early, I forget the year now, 2000s. I sent copies to many people across Canada and that, and it actually documents the policy, and people were shocked to see in writing that they were to contact and provide escort to any bona fide U.S. official to an impact site and all this. It's all laid out in the Space Object Plan, which I got released from the RCMP from a cover letter. And it's a very interesting story in that chapter, how it goes. I'll tell you, it certainly wasn't through the Access to Information Act that I got it released. I caught them in a little misfire in a response to another request, and it's very entertaining. I'll probably be telling that story as part of my presentation in Toronto. But I was a busy guy in the 90s and 2000s, I'll tell you.
The fact that they have a policy, and the fact that this young officer is able to recite it without looking for his handbook, he knew automatically. Well, this is what we have to do. Obviously, this is, it's front and center. They know about this stuff.
The funniest part about it, I think, though, and they were very embarrassed when they first released it to me, and the RCMP chief archivist called to try to explain it, and he ended up laughing trying to explain it to me, I must admit, was the alternate title. We'd looked for this for years and was called the Space Object Contingency Plan, and that's how they referred to it. But it had a second title, and underneath, right on the cover sheet, it says, AKA the Master Plan. You can't make this stuff up.
The undertow of this kind of information, Chris, as you probably know through all of your investigations, the undertow of this points to the fact that this thing is orchestrated. If there's policy on this, as Richard just said, the orchestration, the level of orchestration that's going on among governments, not just the Canadian government, but internationally, how do you interpret that general orchestration of how this thing is kept under the glass ceiling? How do you interpret all of that?
Let me just explain how this got revealed, and it has something to say about this directly. When I caught them up in this, that they'd had this thing, I was actually looking for an RCMP UFO file, and they called up and say, no, we just transferred everything to National Archives. They do this every 3 years, and there's nothing here. In fact, all there is this old policy document called the Space Object. And I go, that's it. That's what I want. And the officer to call me back said, no, it's not. I got your request in front of me. Well, I said, no, that is what I want. I was lying through my teeth. I just said, it's just like I didn't know what it was properly called. Could you please give me the actual file number? And this is how this began. Because every time you asked, they never knew what we were talking about. So they gave me the file number, and when it first came, then the chief archivist called me and said that number didn't make any sense. I said, oh, I'm sure it's correct, because the corporal read it to me, and a few other things. The next thing you know, he called back an hour later and says, I know what you're talking about. Yes, we have it. And I said, yes. He goes, I think I can help you, but this is not going to happen under the Act. And I said, yes. And he went on and he said, look, he says, I can't do it under the Act because I won't have time. He says, I can ask for a 15-day extension, but I still can't respond in 45 days. So what's going to happen is I need permission. Here's the part. from every provincial capital in Canada, from Ottawa, from Washington, and from Moscow, because it reveals our working relationship on UFOs with foreign powers.
Wow.
With Moscow? We have this arrangement with Moscow?
Well, apparently we had it. And what happened is, so what I said to him was, look, as long as I can see we're making progress and I get updates from you, I said, I see no reason to complain to the Information Commissioner of Canada. And he said, well, I can do
Nicely
that.
played.
And he called me, once a month through to it and said, well, I got the letter from Regina, I got the letter from Washington, I got, And when it first arrived, it was very interesting because it tells you everything from what agency's in charge, how far downwind you're supposed to stand. It had scripts in it for cover stories and everything.
Scripts
and it was
for cover
released
stories?
to me unredacted. They even paid for the photocopying. Better service than National Archives.
This is a major disclosure document. I'm sorry, but this makes that New York Times story look pale in comparison.
Well, it's all documented.
Am I wrong?
In the book, and the chapter's called "The Master Plan." This is in the newer book, the Impact to Contact.
Can we get this online, Chris?
I'd be glad to send you a copy here.
That would be fantastic because
there's like about 50 pages, and I'm not sure the cover. It might take me a day or two to get it to you.
That's fine.
Up. No one's been interested for a while.
Well, that whole thing, as Richard is saying, it's another piece of this puzzle, another converging line of evidence.
Yeah, I have the cover letter with it when they released it and everything.
It's a major piece of the puzzle because when we look at what the New York Times story was all about, $22 million, we're studying advanced, we're assessing the threat and so forth. Here's a major piece of policy on how to handle them. Here's a cover story if you need a script.
It's about unknown objects. They never use the term UFO in it, but it's very clear what they're talking about.
Well, in my interactions with NORAD, and I've had a lot, specifically with the NORAD commander in Colorado. And they use terms like non-correlated targets. TOIs, tracks of interest, unknowns. Yeah. So they always skirt around the issue. And the idea behind what you don't say as opposed to what you do say, what you don't say is just as powerful as what you do. In some ways, it's more powerful.
You need to print that document, and you need to hand that to someone at the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, because as far as I'm concerned, Chris, this is the first time I'm hearing about it. This is big. This is monumental.
If you can,
am I exaggerating?
No, I don't think you are.
Well, back in the day, I sent it to the old CANUFO website, and there were about 10 people contact me, and of course I get them copies. In those days, I was mostly mailing hard copies, and it wasn't anything I held to my chest, but there wasn't a great deal of interest at the time, to be honest.
Well, maybe now the time is right.
Well, maybe it is. Anyway, I'll get them to you as some attachments there somehow, or send one up to you for sure.
For sure. That's
of course,
something.
We'll be seeing you in Toronto there in June, too.
Well, the thing is, there's a bit of a time constraint here because the Canadian Research Council on UFOs that I've just established, we have a page on the MUFON site that Stu and Ryan Stacey put together. And we have a number of documents up there. They're going to be growing, let's put it that way. And the documents that we do have up there are from the 9,500 files. However, if you can get me this particular policy document and I can go through it and find out what the salient pages are, I have a major network here in Canada. I'm not going to use the call letters on the air here, but that may be interested and has already covered the Pentagon issue in an interview.
This would have been the rules of the RCMP. Like when they went to a case and they would call the provincial division, they would have called Ottawa and referred to this. This was the rules, you see.
That's a big picture. It's a big picture policy document.
And this applied to UFOs. Of course, it also applied to anything such as Cosmos 954.
Sure, yeah.
That fell in the high Arctic there.
Right.
The Soviet nuclear satellite that made such a mass, Skylab, etc. This is what they were referred to. But any unknown object from space that landed, these were the rules for the RCMP.
But those stories don't need cover story scripts, do they?
Well, there's actually scripts in it at the end of how to deal with the media and that. There's suggestions.
Okay, dealing with the media is one thing, but a cover story script, here's one you can use, no, they don't need that for if a satellite falls out of the sky.
Or an atomic furnace.
Or, indeed. This is amazing. We're about to head into a break. When we come back, are you good to talk a little bit about Falcon Lake? I mean, I know it's not
Well,
Shag
I
Harbour.
can tell you what I learned about it when I was Ottawa in '94, and I interviewed Squadron Leader William Bain face to face. He was with the air desk at the time, one of the two majors that ran it.
All right, we'll do that when we come back.
Yeah, the topic came up, of course.
All right, Chris Stiles stays with us. Victor Viggiani, on to Falcon Lake, sometimes described as Canada's best documented UFO case, although Chris Stiles would beg to differ. Well, we'll get into that when we come back. Also, John Podesta on a recent episode of Ancient Aliens. We'll discuss that as well. Stay with us.
Where there's smoke, there's The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Brought to you.
Everything. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
Chris Stiles is with us, co-author of Dark Object, about the Shag Harbour UFO incident, co-author of From Impact to Contact, and we're about to discuss the Falcon Lake UFO incident. Victor Viggiani also here from Zealand News Network, and just a reminder again, the Alien Cosmic Expo conference coming up June 22nd, 23rd, 24th at the Toronto Airport Marriott Hotel. And for more information and tickets, you can go to aliencosmicexpo.com or my live events page at strangeplanet.ca. I'll be moderating a roundtable discussion on disclosure on Sunday. That's the 24th of June. All right, the Falcon Lake, I mentioned earlier that the Royal Mint, Canadian Royal Mint, they've now sold out of their commemorative coin on the Falcon Lake UFO incident, and we're waiting for the Shag Harbour commemorative coin. That must, I'm sure that's in the works. But take us back to Falcon Lake, because it's also 1967, but this is in Manitoba. And this is a very unique incident in that we actually have what appears to be a physical injury related to this UFO incident. Now, is it Stefan Michalik? Is that how you pronounce his name, or Michalak?
Well, I've heard so many pronunciations. most people seem to think now that it's Stefan Mihalik.
Mihalik, okay.
But I've heard so many variants, you know.
So he goes into the woods near Falcon Lake, Manitoba, and he sees this object, and he has these burns, like a waffle iron type pattern on his chest.
Yeah, supposedly there was a hot discharge from a vent on the side of the UFO, you know, that had landed or was just above the ground, right? I've never investigated this case. It's a very well-known one. It's been looked at. But the topic of that did come up when we were talking about how things ran at the air desk. I was lucky enough back in 1994 to interview Squadron Leader William Bain. He was retired then, who was one of the two majors through the 60s at the air desk in Ottawa. And when that case come up, I was rather surprised, actually, you know, because I wanted to know what his impressions were. And he thought that the case was of merit and was genuine and that, you know, they were being told the truth. And I was slightly surprised by that. Not that I'm questioning the merit of his testimony of Stefan Mihalik, but the thing is, I know that the Americans, the Condon Committee went up and did an on-site investigation with the case, right? And they thought they were being given the runaround in the woods. And, you know, mind you, one of the investigators thought perhaps it was because he didn't want to show claims he was a prospector. But generally, they did not feel good about the story and the evidence. One of the other interesting things is apparently the Mounties tried to get him to recant. They actually took him out and got him drunk a few times.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and befriended him and things. There was all kinds of shenanigans going on. But the thing is that, you know, Bain said he thought it was quite genuine, although one of the other Mounties thought that the radioactive samples from the pure radium and the smears they found in the rock had been material that they thought was stolen from a nearby local hospital. So, you know, it was somewhat controversial, but it's interesting to note, too, I was very surprised at this, that Bain, you know, who felt very strongly about Shag Harbour and felt it was a genuine incident, he felt the same was true about Falcon Lake. And he even told me about personal sightings he had, which when he was a pilot flying S-2 subtractors off the coast of Nova Scotia, you know. So I suppose he was in the believer camp, so it might have been easier for him, but the problem I had with Falcon Lake, why I always found Shag Harbour more interesting, is essentially Falcon Lake is a single witness case largely.
Right.
And it stands that weakness where we have double-digit witnesses and, you know, lots of involvement in the Shag Harbour case. But it's certainly a case of merit. It's one of the great Canadian cases. It's the largest UFO file in terms of what's socked away there in Records Group 77 in Ottawa.
Interesting.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Definitely one of the biggies.
And then here we have two. He sees two craft.
Yes.
One is flying at very high speed. The other lands about 100 feet from him. He goes up and he touches it, burns his hand, and then, as you say,
attempts to communicate with the occupants.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting testimony from his son, who was, I think, 9 years old at the time. Mm-hmm. And he just remembers his father being in bed, very sick, looking very pale, and he remembers, he said something that reminded me of what you mentioned about the smell of the foam in Shag Harbour. You said it smelled like sulfur. And that's exactly what Stan said about when he went into the room. That's the first thing that struck him was the god-awful smell. He said it smelled like sulfur and a burnt-out engine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you can clearly see it. There are many photographs that exist of his injury. And eventually, I think he went down to, the Mayo Clinic for treatment in the U.S. And it is what it is. What I can tell you is, like I say, there was a difference between U.S. authorities and ours. But I know in Ottawa, when I spoke with Bain and some other staffers there, they thought it was of merit and genuine, and they generally believed the prospector's story.
Why would the RCMP bother to take him out, try to get him to recant his story, get him drunk? Why don't they could have just let it go away? You know, why were they so intent on getting him to recant?
The world wanted more of it. Once the word gets out and people kept coming up and doing follow-up investigations, and I guess they thought if they could get rid of it quick and easy and just do away with it, perhaps it would stop, U.S. authorities from coming up and others and the media attention, I mean, when in doubt, you try to cool these things down. I mean, look, after Shag Harbour, I found many clippings in there that were in Ottawa in the Air Desk files. One was of a quote from a Nova Scotia newspaper called The Province that used to exist. And in it, there's a little story where they're interviewing one of the NRC guys that took over from the Air Desk.
Yes.
And he said, they're saying, they're asking about Shag Harbour, and at the bottom, they write in the column beside it with an arrow point and say, these statements do not help the situation in Nova Scotia.
They do not help
and
the
what
situation.
the headline on the story was he could believe in UFOs.
That's fascinating.
So, you know, being a PhD and an NRC guy, you can't ignore it. Great on a slow news day.
We're going to head into a break here shortly, but what was it about 1967? What was, I mean, south of the border, you had the UFO incidents at Malmstrom and these nuke bases. What was going on, Victor? What do you think?
Well, the one in 65 in Pennsylvania, the Kecksburg incident,
right.
very, very puzzling incident. It just seemed that particular period of time, either the awareness was up and people's eyes were to the skies more, or there were in fact more intrusive incursions in our airspace by these craft of unknown origin. It's really hard to say, and I think when it comes right down to it, eventually, when we do find out what's going on, you're going to see these hills and valleys and, you know, high peaks and low peaks of these sightings, and there's probably reasons for that, very, very specific reasons, and which have to do with governmental involvement and communication with these extraterrestrials.
When we come back, John Podesta, Hillary's failed campaign manager, was recently on an episode of Ancient Aliens. We'll find out what that was all about when The Conspiracy Show returns. Stay with us.
Shaking the world and seeing what falls. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
And CFZM AM, owned and operated by MZ Media Incorporated.
The truth is not out there. It's right here. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Hey, welcome back. Chris Stiles is with us, and he will be speaking also Sunday, June 24th at 10:30 a.m. at the Alien Cosmic Expo. He'll be talking all about Shag Harbour and Shelburne, Nova Scotia, the UFO incident back in 1967, October of 1967. Again, the Alien Cosmic Expo, June 22, 23, 24. All of the luminaries in the field of ufology. Stanton Friedman will be making his penultimate appearance there. After that, he's on to Roswell in July, and then no more live appearances from Stanton Friedman. Of course, Richard Dolan, Linda Moulton Howe, Grant Cameron. I mentioned Richard Dolan. Victor Viggiani, of course, here in studio from Zealand News Network. Kathleen Marden will be there, the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, of course, the preeminent alien abduction case. So, again, that's at the Toronto Marriott Hotel, Toronto Airport Marriott Hotel, aliencosmicexpo.com for more information. I'll be there on the 24th as well, moderating the roundtable on UFO disclosure. I wanted to talk about John Podesta, who appeared recently on an episode of Ancient Aliens. Now, this is kind of an interesting episode. They're speculating that had Clinton would have led a UFO disclosure movement had she won the presidency, and there's some implication that the CIA and the Pentagon were worried about Hillary, and therefore they arranged for her to lose the election in order to prevent UFO disclosure. Interesting premise for a program. However, I haven't seen it. Victor, you have, and your thoughts?
Well, I've been watching that program now for, this is the 13th episode, I think, in terms of the
13th season, yes.
Season, rather. Yeah, and their main thrust is the ancient alien theory that these extraterrestrials have been here for thousands and thousands of years, and that we may have originated from them, and all kinds of information about Egypt and Samaria.
Right.
Stay within that bailiwick, in the confines of that, and they do it in a quality way. It's a little bit of a stretch sometimes, but they stay within that bailiwick, in the confines of that theory. However, this season, the first episode, is called The UFO Conspiracy, and it's a 2-hour episode, which is unusual. All of them are just 1 hour. And they go into literally everything that's regarding this whole disclosure issue. They start off with the Clintons, for example. They talk about exactly what you just talked about Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton's, their interest. They go into the findings of Grant Cameron with respect to the Rockefeller Initiative and the initiative that Lawrence S. Rockefeller took with the Clinton family, in particular President Clinton at the time, to come clean on UFOs and the extraterrestrial presence. They also talk about what Clinton wanted to find out through Webster Hubble. And when Clinton came out as president, he wanted to find out two things. And he brought Webster Hubble in to the Justice Department and said, I want you to find out two things. Number one, who killed JFK? And number two, are there such things as UFOs and aliens? They talk about that. What else? They talked about Eisenhower's involvement. They also talked about John Podesta, as you referenced. John Podesta is salt and peppered all the way through the 2 hours with some very, very incisive information about what levels of security and secrecy each president has as they come through the Oval Office. Talking about some have a real tight fist on secrecy, and others kind of more open. And his insights are really interesting because he spent so much time as the chief of staff with Clinton. He got to see exactly not only what Clinton believed, and he called him one of the most curious people, or most curiosity-centered persons that he's ever known in his life. This is, from the mouth of John Podesta. So it's quite interesting that Ancient Aliens would have taken on this tack. And not only did they do that, they went to the 2013 citizen hearings on disclosure that were held in May and April 2013. That was organized by Stephen Bassett with the five congressmen and one senator. And they brought forward about 30 people, 30 witnesses with over 40 hours of testimony. And they had clips of that. Paul Hellyer was on, Richard Dolan was on, and it really surprised me the level of accuracy, number one, and the production value of this particular episode. And it really kind of struck me that not only is Ancient Aliens going back and looking at what these things might have been in the past, but they're also looking forward to what this whole disclosure issue might be.
Right.
And that's where I think they're going with this. And so it was an extremely incisive, very well done, very professionally oriented kind of program that I think if it's ever on again, I think they do a bit of a loop on this. They'll probably play it back again in 2 or 3 weeks. So I would really encourage people to kind of look at it. If you're on Bell, it's on 15 History Channel.
Right, right. What's curious to me is why presidents and other high-profile political figures are always so curious after they're in office. If Hillary Clinton was so big on this issue, why wasn't she when she had the podium as Secretary of State talking about this? And why does Bill Clinton wait until he's out of office for 12 years before going on Jimmy Kimmel and yucking it up about Area 51? Yeah. If they're being genuine and they are curious about it, why aren't they curious while they're in office? I find that very odd.
Yeah, I know. It's something that I've wondered about all along. And if you go back with many of the presidents, Jimmy Carter, for example, he was dead set against secrecy. And he asked at the time, the CIA director, George W. Bush Sr., he said, as president-elect, I want the UFO files. I want access to them. And Bush said to him at the time, Mr. President, you don't have a need to know. And he went on from there and eventually struck a deal with, I guess, someone just to keep quiet while he was in office. I know lots of stuff was going on.
See, if that happened to me, if I was president, if I were Jimmy Carter, I'd just, in the interest of transparency, I'd just come out and say, well, you know what? At a press conference, I'd just blurt it out. I'd say, you know what? I'm very interested in UFOs. You might call me crazy, but I saw one once, and I asked the CIA director, and he told me I don't have a need to know. I'd just blow it right out of the water, just like that.
Well, I think in you saying that, that brings up the point. What kind of pressure would they have been under from other parts within the intelligence community to say, Mr. President, if you start talking about this kind of stuff, your credibility is going to go down the drain very, very quickly. So there may be political pressure as to why they don't say anything. Reagan attempted to. He went before the UN and talked about if an unknown threat came, we would all be much more united. He skirted the issue.
But he was using it metaphorically.
He was, yes. But we know for a fact that he was extremely involved in the UFO.
Well, the other option is to do like Ike in his farewell address. You spill the beans on your way out while you still have the microphone.
Yeah. I think it points to the power of the deep state government. And when you take a look at the power that the presidents have regarding everything from national security to policy making, et cetera, that they don't really run the government. They really don't. And if they do go out on the limb, I think the intelligence communities have ways of dealing with people. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and people will they'll disagree with me on this, and many others who feel the same way as I do, it's one of the reasons why JFK was put away. That's one of the theories, and I happen to subscribe to that because of all of the information within the Kennedy camp at the time and his communication with the national security advisors and Moscow about all this stuff. And also, we have clear evidence, very clear evidence from Daniel Sheehan, the Watergate lawyer involved in it, talking with the former president of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, about the existence. And he was told directly by Gorbachev, these things exist. So sitting people don't really have the luxury of standing on the podium and saying what you're saying. I think that they feel the threats of the deep state. And that's one of the reasons why I think they just keep quiet.
Chris, you're a real boots on the ground, kind of, knock on doors, roll up your sleeves, do the research. Where are you in this whole UFO disclosure? Is it something that you think about, or are you just the facts, ma'am, just the facts?
Well, the problem I have with it, I mean, in one sense, I have no problem with it, but if the government was suddenly to tell me and fess up, hey, look, here's the deal, what we know about the aliens, and here's any deal we might have with them, I'd be just as suspicious of the admission as I would of their denials.
Right.
I'd kind of like to have it come from somewhere else. But, I was listening to just what the two of you were saying there, and maybe it's like that awful movie, Independence Day, like where they tell the president when he asks, how come I didn't know about this? He goes, sir, you don't have the security clearance.
That's right.
Right.
It's like that old Johnny
that
Carson
might be
show.
more true than we know.
Yeah. It's like the old Johnny Carson show. Who do you trust? Nobody.
Well, so then where does that leave us? Let's just, in the couple of minutes that remain, talk about, again, what happened in December with Luis Elizondo, revealing that he'd been in charge of the secret Pentagon program, ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. We know Robert Bigelow was involved, and his private space exploration company. They brought Bigelow on stream because he had a facility where you could study stuff under top secret conditions. What does Bigelow have, do you think, Victor?
From my understanding, he has a building with materials in it. That's what he was saying.
With materials.
With materials, like actual physical materials that can be inspected and analyzed. That's what I understand he has.
So it's been 5 months since the New York Times article. Where is Bigelow in all this? Why isn't he telling us more?
It's I think it goes back to what Chris was talking about. As soon as information comes out from either an independent agency or a government agency, it's a matter of who do you trust and how fast will that information be discredited. And I think Bigelow went out on a limb in 60 Minutes when he talked about, he was interviewed and said, the lady interviewer said, if you come forward with this, people are going to think you're crazy. And he said, I don't care. I just don't care. So do they give him more airtime to come and talk more about this and to have it come out in an independent way? Or is there some sort of conduit through which the Pentagon is working to have this information come out on almost a two-prong approach, an independent and a governmental? So we have to kind of balance those two and see how this whole disclosure issue, the stew percolates, and it's getting much more tasty, let me tell you. And I think we've only just scratched the surface as to how this disclosure issue is going to unfold in the next 6 to 8 months.
To be continued, June 22nd, 23rd, 24th at the Alien Cosmic Expo. Victor Viggiani, Zealand News Network. Very quickly, how do people read your dispatches?
Zealand Communications News Blog.
Zealand Communications News Blog.
We have Linda Moulton Howell booked. Linda Moulton Howell is booked before ACE.
All right, Linda Moulton Howell will be on the program towards the end of May. All right, Chris Stiles, thank you. We'll see you there as well.
It was a pleasure.
Dark Objects and From Impact to Contact. Thanks to Ian Robertson, Albert Vinzel, and Ryan White back next week with a brand new program. We'll take a humorous look at political correctness. And Rosemary Ellen Guiley as well will be here. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light, what I say in a whisper. Proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite, I'm coming home. Good night.